Hello, and everyone, and welcome to our spring water webinar series. My name is Fiona McDonald, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the Events and Communications Lead with the Invasive Species Council of British Columbia, and I am joining you today from the unceded, ancestral, and traditional homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, also known as Vancouver. So thank you so much for joining us today in the first of our water aquatic invasive species. We're going to be exploring aquatic invasives through a community science lens today and how to report and take action. We also have some other exciting webinars coming up this month as part of the series. And next week, we'll be joined by Camille LeBlanc from Living Lakes Canada. Registration will open for that webinar tomorrow, so keep an eye on our website. This webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions during the presentation for our presenters, you are welcome to put them in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. That is different to the chat box, which you are also welcome to use. Please check the list of questions, and if you see the question you had is already in there, you can click a thumbs up button and upvote that, so it will move it to the top of the list. And if we run out of time to answer your question, we can connect with you and get you your answers. Just a couple of tech checks in Zoom. You do have the option to select active speaker view or gallery view at the top of your screen. We recommend the speaker view. I'm going to introduce our speakers now, but as I do, I'd welcome you to join us in the chat. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, what your area of interest is. So our two speakers today are Ruby Banwait and Stephen Hayward. Ruby is a champion of ocean conservation, and she's explored many environments beneath the surface, from the Salish Sea to the Arctic Ocean. A Royal Canadian Geographical Society Fellow, she helped launch the Petty Harbour Marine Aquarium in Newfoundland, a seasonal capture and release educational facility. Ruby's desire to restore abundance in our ocean motivates her to connect people to the sea. As community science lead with the Invasive Species of BC, Species Council of BC, ISCBC, Ruby encourages biodiversity protection and fostering lasting relationships with nature while supporting accessibility and conservation. And joining Ruby is Stephen Hayward. He is a science and data coordinator for ISCBC, working to create resources and programs to get people across British Columbia engaged in protecting BC's biodiversity. He is a biologist with experience in invasive species management and animal behavior research, as well as organizing and participating in community science initiatives. He is interested in Canadian natural history and ecology, and an active user on iNaturalist, currently engaged with BC's birds, mosses, lichens, and old growth ecosystems. Welcome, Ruby and Stephen.
Thank you, Fiona, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. As Fiona said, my name is Ruby, and I work as the community science lead with ISCBC, and I am pleased to be joining you today from the traditional, unceded, and occupied lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'll be introducing you to some aquatic invasive species and what we can do about them alongside my colleague, Stephen Hayward.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen, and I live, work, and play on the unceded traditional territories of the Snuneymuxw First Nation in Nanaimo, BC.
All right, so let's get started with some high-level introductions into aquatic invasive species, and we'll take a look at that through a community science approach to help stopping their spread. So aquatic invasive species come in many different forms, from plants, amphibians, fish and fungi, to different types of parasites. Like all invasive species, these organisms are not native to these local environments, and they've been introduced to a new habitat in one way or another. Like all invasive species, aquatic invasives have detrimental social, economic, and environmental impacts. Aquatic invasive species move around by both human-made and natural pathways. So natural pathways include things like rivers, ocean currents, and wind. And while natural pathways don't often move aquatic invasive species as far as human-made ones, it's often how they get dispersed once they've established in an area. Human-made pathways can be separated into transportation pathways and live industry pathways. So transportation pathways are international shipping, where we can spread aquatic invasive species unintentionally. Live industry pathways such as horticulture and the pet and aquarium trades can move aquatic invasive species unintentionally or intentionally, but often without the knowledge of the risks of those aquatic invasives. So vectors are agents of spread. For example, cargo ships can transport aquatic invasive species in ballast water or as hull hitchhikers. Boats, trailers, stand-up paddle boards, fishing gear, kayaks, to name a few, those can all be vectors of spread for aquatic invasive species if they aren't cleaned, drained, and dried when moving between different water bodies. People can spread aquatic invasive species unintentionally when cleaning home aquariums if unwanted organic materials are not carefully disposed of. Worse yet, people can also intentionally release unwanted pets into the environment, which is cruel, dangerous, and actually illegal. In 2021, a shipment of aquarium mossballs, which is a type of green algae, was imported from Europe and found to be infested with live zebra mussels. So these freshwater bivalves are considered to be some of the most highly dangerous aquatic invasive species, as they have the potential to impact hydro operations, water irrigation systems, and many recreational activities, which could lead to millions of dollars in management. The potential to damage our aquatic food webs and harm critical fish stocks like salmon, sockeye salmon, is immeasurable. Luckily, a pet store employee with a keen eye and quick wit contacted conservation officers and began the process to recall those mothballs from hundreds of locations across the province. So if you find a zebra mussel in a mothball, bag it, freeze it, and then please come and talk to us. Early detection and rapid response to the introduction of zebra mussels in BC is critical. So if you observe it, report it. The spread of aquatic invasive species impacts the social, economic, and environmental impacts or aspects of all of our lives. The risk to biodiversity, our economy are severe, and as well as our physical and our mental well-being. So in this next slide here, you'll see some notable freshwater aquatic invasive species, including a freshwater jelly that was recently detected in a lake on Vancouver Island. And then in this next slide, you can see some examples of marine invasive species, which include the European green crab, which is quickly spreading across the southern coast of BC. We will be releasing an entire online learning course about this species and how to help people identify them, and even to become certified in European green crab monitoring. So make sure you check into our website in our learning center. So our native species, such as coho salmon, can be severely impacted by aquatic invasive species like Japanese knotweed, yellow flag iris, and purple loosestrife. Japanese knotweed erodes stream banks and increases river sedimentation. Purple loosestrife can impact foraging capabilities of juvenile salmon, limiting their growth and increasing the risk of disease. Yellow flag iris increases sedimentation in water and blocks access to spawning streams. Luckily, there are ways that we can help prevent the establishment and spread of aquatic invasive species. And now I'll turn it over to Stephen to tell you a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Ruby. So one key way people can make a difference in preventing the spread of invasive species is by participating in community science and reporting and observing invasive species you know or organisms you're unfamiliar with. You can use the Report Invasives BC app, which is a direct line to government officials, or iNaturalist, which is an online global database of native and invasive species with a community of naturalists to help identify what you found. Both of these apps are free on both Apple and Android app stores, and both of them are used by scientists, policymakers, and invasive species specialists to develop work plans and map new infestations of invasive species spread. There are a couple different ways that you can observe and report aquatic invasive species, whether it's you get a clear photo through the water, something dead and has washed up on the shoreline. you've hooked something unfamiliar on your fishing line, or even you've spotted a new mussel on the hull of your boat. These are all ways that you can report and observe aquatic invasive species. Our staff at ISCBC has been very active on both those apps. And when we were filming YouTube content at Hastings Park in Vancouver, we noticed some fish that seemed out of place. So Ruby and our science lead, Nick, with some encouragement from a provincial biologist, went back, scooped one out, and we got a positive ID on the rosy red minnow, whose common name also can be fathead minnow, in Hastings Park. We dug into it a little bit more and found another user on iNaturalist had spotted that same species a couple months before us, and it's very likely that that population had started due to someone dumping an aquarium full of unwanted pets into that pond. But we can also get some reports through unexpected ways, such as this invasive pond louch or oriental weatherfish, which has 5 observations in British Columbia, located around Coquitlam on the Fraser River and Pitt River. 3 of those 5 observations actually come from birders and nature photographers whose primary objective that day was likely to get nice shots of the waterfowl they found, but upon seeing that they were eating something that they didn't know, uploaded 2 separate observations on iNaturalist, one for the fish and one for the bird, with people identifying the fish as the invasive pond louch. So it's a very unexpected way that we were able to gain new data on aquatic invasive species spread, as well as gain some insights into their interactions with our native ecosystems and species. iNaturalist and report invasive species observations can lead to change. We have a project called I Spy and Identify Invasives on iNaturalist. And from August to January of this year, we had almost 12,000 observations. We're looking to grow this network into 2022 and encourage more people to take action and report invasive species during Invasive Species Action Month coming up in May, the City Nature Challenge BioBlitz at the end of April and start of May. And we're hoping to gain more ears and eyes on the ground all across British Columbia. These observations can be used to visualize the spread of a particular invasive species, such as the European green crab, which was first spotted in 1989 in San Francisco and has slowly made its way northward and is now found around Vancouver Island and the ocean around Vancouver. It's one of our worst marine invaders and a species of note for the provincial government who are trying to contain and manage the species. One troubling aspect is the continual northward spread of this species, which makes you wonder how cold of waters can this European green crab live in, and whether our Arctic oceans may be more at risk with warming ocean waters and increased global shipping lines due to sea ice decline. The provincial government has released some projections on what we can expect from climate change to see in the coming decades. Skimming through the list, we can see several that have occurred just in the past year alone, and some of them are especially relevant when it comes to aquatic invasive species and their spread, such as ocean acidification, warming ocean waters, intense and frequent heavy rain events and flooding, which can transport freshwater aquatic invasives around, or changes in stream flow patterns and lake levels. One very interesting, but also disturbing study that's coming out from the Heat Dome event last summer was a study calculating intertidal organism mortality rates compared to average ocean and air temperature change. This study is being led by Dr. Chris Harley at UBC and Dr. Wendell Raymond at University of Washington. And Dr. Harley provided me a couple slides from previous conference talks for me to use today. So this first map shows that average temperature departure from average on June 28th, right during the Heat Dome event. You can see the Georgia Strait around Nanaimo in the Salish Sea got much, much hotter than average on that particular day compared to the Juan de Fuca bordering Victoria, which didn't seem to have that huge spike in temperature, whether it was due to fog levels, ocean air currents, or whatever. It just was not as hot as the Georgia Strait. Their preliminary results show that this increased temperature in the Georgia Strait was associated with mass die-offs of native clams, mussels, barnacles, and other intertidal organisms compared to the Juan de Fuca Strait, which didn't get as hot, and these mass die-offs weren't noted. This difference in invasive and native species mortality rates can be illustrated by this photo of this boulder taken in the Georgia Strait, where you can see our native Pacific acorn barnacle in the white circle in the top left, our native California mussel in the red square at the bottom, were all dead in this area, while the invasive Japanese oyster in the yellow circle had survived. One key point is that our native marine organisms are adapted to cold ocean temperatures, while a lot of the invasive aquatics come from warmer ocean temperature areas near the equator, and climate change could indeed favor these invasive organisms' survival and reproduction. And it really paints this troubling photo moving forward on how climate change will interact with aquatic invasive species, and showcases that this lens should be looked at in terms of invasive species management and research. So reporting and observing is just one way that you can make a difference in terms of preventing the spread of invasive organisms. The other is to join our community science network.
Participating in community science is a great way to help protect BC's biodiversity from aquatic invasive species. Our community science network has a wide, a wide range of resources to help make an impact and help you become a leader in your community. You'll also find additional youth-specific resources for those of you between the ages of 15 and 30. We're encouraging people to learn, report, and take action to protect BC's nature. Make sure to join our webinar next week, March 22nd, to learn more about another incredible community science opportunity with Living Lakes Canada. So one of the easiest and most effective ways to take action is by adopting these best practices that you see here. We hope these initiatives will become household taglines across BC. So keep an eye out for our newest initiative, also called Squeal on Pigs. We want to make it easy for people to learn more and to be able to share with others. So if you haven't already, check out the wide selection of interesting courses available in our Learning Center and on our website. We have a community science course that's available, and we are leveling up the Learning Center this year. So there's going to be a lot of new courses going in there pretty often. Two of the newest, which will be an aquatic invasive species focused, and there should be one available on freshwater species and marine species. So we're challenging everybody this year to learn something new in 2022. We are also leveling up our social media presence this year and promoting other awesome projects and organizations that also engage in environmental stewardship. You can connect with us on social media using #BCInvasives to see what's going on within the network and across the province. Joining the Community Science Network means you'll also receive our monthly Community Connections e-newsletter, which is full of information, updates, fun activities, and a guaranteed dad joke. So we really hope that you'll join us. Also, we've just joined TikTok, so keep an eye on our social media. There should be a lot of fun things for you to do and people to engage with across the network. So that kind of concludes our little discussion here about aquatic invasive species and how your participation in community science and your willingness to learn a little bit more and help us to spread the word is going to be our best way to prevent the spread of invasive species across our province. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ruby and Stephen, for sharing all that wonderful information with us today. It was very thorough, and I hope people feel inspired to join the Community Science Network. I have a question to start us off, and then there's a few questions from our attendees. Stephen, your example of the minnows in Hastings Park, besides just observing and reporting them, what happens after that? How do, and if there's an infestation of an invasive like that in a pond, how is it dealt with?
So as I said, those reports go to government officials who prioritize based on kind of like species characteristics and kind of the damage they can do to local ecosystems, whether or not action is taken and management is taken. For marine and aquatic invasives, it is a bit harder than, say, a terrestrial plant to remove, but I know that they do that work depending on the species. So it gets added to their database and they can just track and monitor and then decide when and where to take action to kind of reduce the overall harm to our biodiversity and natural ecosystems.
Awesome, thanks. So we have a question from Sophie. Is eDNA used regularly in BC to detect new invasions / spread of established invasions?
I could take that one. I don't think it's regularly used yet. It's definitely more of a novel and newer mechanism for detecting invasive species. Our forum and research conference, we had several people showcasing new methodology and trials of eDNA, and it was definitely very successful. The one negative that they talked about was it didn't do a great job of telling you how much was there and what like the abundance of that species was. It was more presence absence, but I would definitely imagine that it's going to be used more and more moving forward.
Fascinating. The next question that we have from an attendee, I know this wasn't specifically about European green crab, but do you have a sense of how many have now been identified in BC and why are they such a concern?
That's a great question. I bet you that we could probably come up with some statistics from the reports in iNaturalist. I don't know off the top of my head exactly how many that have been recorded, but I know that that information we are trying to capture it. I know that DFO is also working really hard to try to be able to put together a monitoring program so that we can have more boots on the ground identifying it. I think the problem with the European green crab is that they are very successful in foraging for food, and they're kind of like little bulldozers. They just destroy their communities that they're in. So not only can they outcompete our native species for resources, but their foraging practices also can decimate eelgrass beds, which is really, and those eelgrass beds are very important for our local ecosystems, and they act as nursery habitats for a lot of juvenile animals, including fish, like our very important salmon stocks. So they're just a highly successful invasive species because they just outcompete and really kind of destroy the habitats that they're in very easily.
I will add one thing too, in the right settings, they can reproduce very abundantly. There was one story from our research conference of a salt marsh in Washington, I believe, where they knew that there was European green crab there and they were monitoring it. And from one season to the next, the numbers went from in the hundreds to in the thousands. And it really made them launch like an emergency response to remove as many as they could. And that was just one example of kind of like this explosion in population they were able to have. As Ruby mentioned earlier in the talk as well, there will be a European green crab specific course on our e-learning center if you want to dig into that a little bit more and learn more about that invasive species.
Sounds like a great resource. Probably, I think something that I will go and check out as well. We have another question that is definitely a doozy. And so I don't expect Ruby and Stephen to have the answers, but maybe some perspective. Stephen, you were speaking about the massive die-offs we saw, which were due to climate change. And in those examples, it favored some invasive species. Are we seeing trends that invasive species usually are favored in environments that are being affected by climate change, or species to species? It depends.
I don't think we could say that entirely all over, definitely in some scenarios, but I have read some papers where they do modeling on which invasives will be moving north from the United States into Canada, and some invasives will actually be not favored by climate change, and some researchers will project that they should have a decline in their overall population levels. So it kind of just depends on like species to species as well as the particular ecosystem we're talking about.
And for those of you who are joining us today that may be interested in learning more about climate change, we do have a National Climate Change Symposium coming up at the beginning of June. The save the date will be released tomorrow and registration will open April 1st. So I highly encourage you to come learn about climate change and invasive species with us. Lots of questions. Thank you everyone for submitting them. This is from Oliver. It says, it's great to see that you monitor iNaturalist. I often look out for invasives when I'm out at work and I report using the app. Is it preferable to be reporting using the project on iNaturalist rather than both apps, or where does the data go on either one?
So
that's a great question, Oliver. I'm going to let Stephen speak to this one because he's one of our resident iNaturalist gurus and does a lot of reporting on there himself. So go for it, Stephen.
Yeah, so the I Spy and Identify Invasives project on iNaturalist is just a convenient project for us to track like what our network is observing. You only need to join it once. You just click the join button and then all your reports will be added to the project. If you're not in the project, it'll still be in the iNaturalist database, and any researcher or scientist outside of our organization will still be able to see your reports and be able to gain whatever information they're looking for from there. Yeah, realistically, it's tough to submit via both apps. It can depend on the invasives. If it's something really novel and something you've never seen before, I would definitely recommend using the Report Invasive Species app, just because, like I said, it's a direct line to invasive species specialists in the government. I know that there's a ton of government people and biologists on iNaturalist who are on that website every day, so it would be spotted on there. But it could be just a lag of a couple days, a couple weeks before it really reaches the right people who might want to launch like a EDRR response if it's a truly novel or new sighting.
That's really good advice, and not something that I had thought of before. So I will categorize my observations that way going forward. We were talking earlier a bit about how it is difficult with aquatic invasives to observe them, to get to them. They're underwater. So I have someone asking here, when you go for a walk around Burnaby Lake, for example, very easy to see the blackberry, ivy, and holly. We know that people can manually take them out, but is there anything we can do more other than observing and reporting for aquatic invasives?
That's a great question that I'm happy to answer. Prevention is key, I think, especially when it comes to aquatic invasive species. So practicing things like clean, drain, dry, making sure that you're not introducing invasive species from one body of water to another or one area to another. So that's a really great way to make sure that we're reducing and the capability of these species from spreading. Because prevention is really the best way that we have to manage. Once aquatic invasive species especially, its removal and it is costly, it's difficult, and sometimes it's not as effective as we would love for it to be. So making sure that you're doing things like cleaning off your equipment, your recreational, like everyone loves to get outside in our outdoors. BC is so great for all the different water sports that we can, take part in. Fishing is huge. Make sure that your equipment is cleaned really well. Look it over to make sure that you're not, snagging some, aquatic plants and taking them to a new location. Really make sure that your gear is cleaned and cared for well. And that it's going to be great for you too. Everyone knows that, if you take care of your gear, it'll last a lot longer. So that's a great way to make sure you're saving the environment, saving your pocketbook. And also spreading awareness, sharing that information with other people is really powerful. That's a very, very powerful tool that if we, make that kind of a standard practice for yourself, your family, and your friends, I think that's a great way to start a wave of biodiversity protection across the province, is share that knowledge with people that, that you come across. Also our don't let it loose messaging, aquatic plants and different aquatic species, like certain fish that are maybe used as live bait, things like that can get, intentionally released into the environment. Those can really cause a lot of harm as well. So practicing don't let it loose, if you have live bait that you no longer need, letting it go into your local lake or river system is not the best way to dispose of that. And If you have an animal that you no longer can care for, there's a lot of different ways that you can seek care or, have it rehomed, different things like that, just so you make sure that these species aren't getting out into the environment.
I think it's a really great point what you said about you may unintentionally spread the issue, right? You may feel empowered to help and perhaps go to the pond and get out the fish, but what's the step after that? So it seems to me best to observe and report, and then get professional experts in on proper removal and management. We do have another question, and we still have some time. So if you're still with us and have some questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. The next one is an interesting one, bringing terrestrial to the aquatic world. Can you tell us more about how plants like Japanese knotweed and the plants that grow on riverbanks can create challenging environments for native fish?
Yeah, absolutely. Japanese knotweed can clog up waterways. It can erode the stream banks. So not only can it, increase turbidity in the water, which will make, foraging for food for certain animals more difficult. Water quality can decrease, and it spreads also very, very quickly. So it becomes, a way that it can clog up that waterway very quickly. So Japanese knotweed is, it's a very successful aquatic invasive species as well. So it really just, it challenges that habitat by taking it over and making it, making it less, I don't know, great for native species. It's just, it'll decrease the viability of that habitat to support a native species.
I'll add on with Japanese knotweed, I've read that the root system actually doesn't hold soil as well as kind of like the average root system, which will lead to like stream bank erosion quicker than if native plants were planted along that stream bank. And then with the yellow flag iris example, they can grow in quite dense monocultures, which can actually like block off like access to certain like river channels or even like spawning channels for salmon. It's tough for them to get through those dense monocultures of aquatic plants.
Fascinating. Okay, well, we're through the questions and answers. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you Ruby and Stephen for all that wonderful information. We really do hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we look forward to you joining us next week for the next installment, when we'll be joined by Camille LeBlanc, and registration for that webinar opens tomorrow. We invite you to check out bcinvasives.ca for updates on our community science program, our learning center, and upcoming events. We'd also like to invite you to join the Community Science Network, where you can learn, report, and take action in your community. Everyone is welcome, and you can see the link in the chat for more information. So thank you, and have a great Thursday.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.